I've seen a lot of people voicing their concern with Georgia's inconsistency this season. And look, rightfully so. Georgia has been inconsistent. I've voiced those concerns myself. I'm here to say, if you look around the rest of the country, and I was bringing up this point a couple of weeks ago before the Texas game, I don't think that there's that much to be concerned about. Well, that's not the best way to put it. The rest of the country is also inconsistent. There's not a single team that has been flawless. There's not a single team where you look at it and say, hey, they've just been dominating through and through. This is definitely the number one team in the country. This is definitely the national champion. You can't even really say that about Oregon, and I'll start with that there after we talk about Georgia a little bit. But right, just a quick rundown with Georgia's inconsistency. Top 10 win over Clemson. Boom, big, 34-3 neutral site. Blowout Tennessee Tech. Then it gets dicey for a couple weeks. Struggle with Kentucky. They barely win that game, 13-12. They got rushed by Kentucky. Go to Alabama. Tale of two halves. We've seen that in a handful of football games this year where there's a tale of two halves. Texas A&M and LSU this past weekend is an example. Georgia, Alabama was a good example of that when Georgia got smacked in the first half and then did the smacking in the second half, ends up being too little too late. They lose that game. Looked a little, not bad against Auburn, just wasn't amazing. And then Mississippi State was kind of a roller coaster in terms of how good they looked. Then they beat Texas while not playing efficiently on the offensive side of the football. All over the place, right? It's kind of hard to nail down how good Georgia actually is. And before I jump into the rest of the country, I will say the thing about Georgia that I guess should give you some confidence in the Dogs, those two big wins, right? They've played in 3 huge games so far between Clemson, Alabama, and Texas, and in 2 of them they crushed their opponent. And the other one, they got crushed and then did some crushing and then lost, right? So I think that in terms of big games, Georgia has shown the most prowess, and they've got those 2 top 10 wins. But you go through, and I'm pretty much going through the rankings a little bit out of order here, but Oregon, consistent right now, and you look at their schedule, you look at what they've done, and I try to watch as many of these games as possible. I've watched at least all of these teams at least once live. Oregon looked shaky at the beginning of the season. Now they're starting to come into their own. Good win against Ohio State at home, obviously. They just crushed Illinois, a pretty good football team, 38-9. Beat Purdue 35-0. Beat Michigan State 31. They're on a good streak right now, playing pretty well the last month. So Oregon is kind of the only team here where you can say, all right, they're really finding their groove and they're in it. The rest of the country, I don't know if you can exactly say that, right? So Oregon, shaky at the beginning of the season, now looks better. I think they've earned that number one next to their name so far, next to the name. Ohio State, crushing cupcakes at the beginning of the year. They crush Akron. They crushed Western Michigan. Marshall, a little bit of dancing around with Marshall there in the first quarter, if you remember that game. They beat Michigan State fine, 38-7. Iowa, same thing. They don't have to blow out these opponents. They lose to Oregon, right? So a loss there. Obviously, it's a road loss. It's a 1-point loss to another top 5 opponent. You're not going to get penalized that much for that. I think in a rematch, it would be an interesting game. And if there is a rematch, it will be most likely on a neutral site. Nebraska. Oregon and Ohio State, Nebraska. Then the Buckeyes really fool around. Nebraska has a chance to win that game in the second half. They're leading for a good bit of that game. Ohio State wins. But you're saying, okay, well, they were consistent at the beginning of the year beating bad opponents. Nebraska's not a very good opponent. They struggle with them. They lose to Oregon. Maybe Ohio State is kind of being inconsistent. Obviously, they've got that matchup at Penn State, number 3 in the country. This is a huge Big Ten matchup. It's going to come at noon. Going to get to catch some of that before we have to go into the stadium in Jacksonville. And then that brings me to Penn State, right? 34-12 West Virginia, whatever. It was kind of a lame win. That's a bad way to put it. They didn't just blow them out. Bowling Green, that was a tough one. Penn State could have lost to Bowling Green. You're like, whoa, right? Pump the brakes. Then they kill Kent State. Then they get a strong win over Illinois, 21-7. Not very flashy, but it's a strong win. 27-11 over UCLA. They have to claw back and beat USC in overtime. Then they beat Wisconsin 28-13. Not looking that great. The backup quarterback looks pretty good too. Penn State hasn't shown as much dominance, and then there's a little bit of inconsistency there. Obviously, a win against Ohio State would change my mind, would change a lot of people's mind. Ron Curley from Dawg Post here. Excuse me. Link to the newsletter. It's down below in the description of this video. Make sure you're checking it out. It's free. That's all I ask. We're pushing out a lot of content at dawgpost.com. Texas. Talked about it a lot, so I won't spend too much time here. But you know the drill. Hot at the beginning of the season. Haven't really played anyone. They finally play someone with Georgia. They lose. And then they almost lose. They didn't really almost lose, but Vanderbilt gave them a fight there, 27-24. One of those touchdowns coming at the end of that game. So Texas went from bona fide number one team in the country to, all right, starting to struggle. All right, team is not as good as people thought. Miami, right, actually ranked ahead of Texas right now. They started the season pretty strong, beat a bad Florida team who's turned out to be not as bad as we thought. Kill a couple of cupcakes. Fight with South Florida at the beginning of the game, but then they crush them in the second half. Virginia Tech, that's a game 100% Miami could have lost. 38-34 was back and forth in an exciting Friday night game a few weeks back at Cal. I turned that game off, right? This was a late night game. Cal was beating Miami big time comeback. Could have lost to not a good Cal team. Louisville, right? That was a fight back and forth. So Miami, they're fighting around with some teams that aren't that great. 36-14. I thought they could have beat Florida State by more than that. We'll see. The good thing for Miami is they might not be completely challenged. They should win out. This should be a team that goes 12-0 when you think about they're just playing Duke, Georgia Tech, Wake Forest, and Syracuse. They're better than all those teams. Very, very possible Miami is a 13-0 ACC champion if they go on to beat who will probably be Clemson in that game. Tennessee. By the way, I didn't bring Clemson up here. Obviously, they get crushed by Georgia. That's the only real opponent they played, and then kind of handled business since then. I don't trust Clemson, right? I don't really trust Clemson in that regard. I don't think that getting crushed by Georgia that bad and then not looking amazing the rest of the way against a pretty easy ACC schedule that they were gifted. I don't know. There's something off to me about that Tiger team, and they're starting to get a lot of hype. Dropped a couple spots in the polls this week. Tennessee. Right, so I'm talking about all the teams that still have a chance in my eyes to win the whole thing, technically, even though I really think there's only a couple teams that can really win it. Tennessee, you know the drill here. Same thing, looked really hot against the Cupcakes, putting up a bunch of style points. Ranked matchup with NC State, who's not really a ranked team. They crushed them. They lose at Arkansas at night. It's a tough game. I thought that they could have beat Oklahoma by more. I don't know if I'd buy that Josh Heupel was going easy on them. Had to win in overtime against Florida, a team it's definitely better than. Pretty strong win against Alabama. So to me, Tennessee's kind of been all over the place as well. Another team that I think's been all over the place is A&M, and they literally have with the quarterback in and out. Wigman might not be their guy. They lost to Notre Dame at home at night. That was perplexing to me. Crush a couple cupcakes. They don't crush Bowling Green, and Bowling Green also gave Penn State a fight. Maybe there's something to be said about that. They barely beat Arkansas. They crushed Missouri, right? And then it's like, well, this team really is all over the place. LSU, they're getting beat in the first half. Second half, quarterback change, and they go on a huge run, and they beat LSU 38-23. Do you trust Marcel Reed if he is this new leader of this offense? Now, A&M's got a pretty favorable schedule the rest of the way outside of that Texas game. But I think they've been all over the place. Notre Dame's been all over the place. Obviously, that win against A&M, then they lose to Northern Illinois. They kill some teams. It's close against some teams. They beat Navy. Notre Dame's hitting their stride a little bit, but can't ignore the fact that they lost to Northern Illinois. BYU, winning some close games, crushing some teams. Who's the best team that BYU's played? Probably Kansas State, and they beat them by a big margin. But they barely beat SMU. They barely beat Oklahoma State. I don't know what to make of BYU. I know that they're playing pretty well right now. Indiana, another one. Hasn't really played anybody, but they've looked good doing it. We're going to learn a lot about them towards the end of the year when they play Ohio State, assuming that they beat Michigan State and Michigan, which are next on their schedule, and I think they will do that. So, to me, look, I just did this little look around at the rest of the contenders, right? Teams that are, have a good chance to make the playoff. Obviously, I hit on Clemson a little bit too. We could hit on LSU a little bit. Do I need to say much? That is the definition of inconsistency this season. All of these teams. So to me, Oregon has been the most consistent, especially for the last month. but Georgia's got the strongest pair of wins, and that's why they're 1-2. Georgia has looked inconsistent, but my point here is the entire country has. I don't think you should be too concerned because it's that type of year. No one's dominating yet. Thanks for watching.